Please generate an engaging or spine-chilling story. Please only intro story. On this topic, 52 widows who vanished over 22 years from the Christian charity home, The Inheritance Trap, a mystery hidden in the woods. Provide 10 key turning points for the story before crafting the full introduction. Ensure the story embodies the style of author or filmmaker name, capturing their tone, suspense, and atmosphere, but do not mention their name anywhere in the story. Also, do not add subheadings in the introduction. The story begins with the arrival of Thomas Wren, a journalist whose curiosity often led him into places most people avoided. His latest pursuit took him deep into the secluded outskirts of Pine Hollow, a forgotten stretch of land where mist clung to the treetops and the locals spoke in cautious whispers. Rumors had reached his desk about a peculiar pattern of disappearances, 52 widows, all residents of the same Christian charity home, who had vanished without a trace over the course of 22 years. What intrigued him most wasn't just the staggering number, but the eerie precision of it. Each disappearance happened quietly, predictably, and was followed by silence so profound that it seemed orchestrated. The deeper he dug, the more the story began to smell less like tragedy and more like design. The charity home, known as St. Aurelia's, was supposed to be a refuge, a place of peace for grieving women seeking spiritual solace after loss. Yet, Thomas found that the townsfolk of Pine Hollow treated the place with an uneasy reverence, as though it was both sacred and cursed. The few who spoke of it did so in half-murmured sentences, always glancing over their shoulders. They said the home had stood there for decades, hidden among the dense woods where the air itself felt thicker, older. Every widow who entered was said to have been offered shelter, faith, and a new beginning. None of them were ever seen again. For Thomas, this was more than a story, it was a haunting mystery woven into the bones of a place untouched by time. The journey to Pine Hollow was treacherous. The narrow road snaked through the forest, where sunlight barely reached the ground. By the time he reached the outskirts, the air was damp and heavy with the scent of pine and decay. He found himself standing before an iron gate that bore the name of the charity home, rusted yet unmistakably deliberate, as if preserved for his arrival. Behind it, the silhouette of the building loomed against a darkening sky, massive, solemn, and disturbingly still. Thomas had covered his share of dark stories before, but something about this one felt personal. There was no police investigation, no official acknowledgement, only scattered mentions in old obituaries and missing person notices that had long stopped being printed. It was as though the town had chosen to forget, or perhaps been made to. The few documents he uncovered were neatly filed, the records too precise, as though someone had taken care to leave just enough evidence to suggest normalcy. But standing before the silent charity home, Thomas sensed a presence that no paper could describe, a stillness that seemed to pulse with memory, as if the land itself remembered what everyone else had tried to bury. As Thomas delved deeper into the mystery, he began to notice a chilling thread that connected each of the 52 missing widows' inheritance. Every woman who had vanished had recently come into possession of money, property, or valuable assets shortly before being admitted into St. Aurelia's charity home. At first, it appeared to be coincidence. Grieving widows often sold their homes or received insurance settlements after their husbands' deaths, and perhaps the charity had simply been a refuge for those with nowhere else to go. But the more Thomas studied the records, the clearer the pattern became. Each widow had been financially independent at the time of her disappearance, and each had made a substantial donation to the charity shortly before she vanished. What disturbed him most was that the donations were all made in identical handwriting, despite being signed by different women. The files were meticulous, kept in dusty cabinets within the county archives, receipts, bank transfers, and property deeds, all tracing back to one account linked to the charity home itself. The account was old, older than Sister Marianne's tenure as the head of the institution, and it was guarded with such precision that even the bank manager hesitated to discuss its history. When Thomas pressed further, he discovered that several of the widows' estates had quietly transferred ownership to the charity home after their disappearance, under what appeared to be legitimate wills. But there was something wrong with the signatures, something mechanical and lifeless about them, as though they had been copied rather than written by trembling, aging hands. Thomas began to visit the families of the vanished women, but most had moved away or refused to speak about the home. One elderly man, the nephew of a missing widow named Esther, told him that his aunt had received a letter of invitation from the charity, offering her a place among God's chosen. She had gone willingly, believing she would spend her final years in peace. 2 months later, she was gone. The family received a letter of condolence from Sister Marianne herself, stating that Esther had succumbed to illness and had been laid to rest among the faithful. No grave was ever found. The inheritance connection transformed the story from one of tragedy to something far darker, a pattern of exploitation disguised as salvation. These weren't random disappearances, they were transactions. Each widow was drawn in by the promise of faith and compassion, only to have everything they owned, and eventually their lives, consumed by the home's shadow. Thomas realized that whatever St. Aurelia's truly was, it thrived on more than donations. It fed on the lonely, the grieving, and the rich, turning inheritance into bait, and devotion into a snare. As Thomas spent more time investigating St. Aurelia's, he found himself drawn to the figure at the center of it all, Sister Marianne. To the outside world, she was the embodiment of virtue, a devoted caretaker, a woman whose life had been entirely dedicated to God and the widows she welcomed into the home. Locals spoke of her with reverence, describing her as patient, kind, and unwavering in her faith. They told stories of how she had comforted women through grief, prayed with them through sleepless nights, and guided them with wisdom and gentleness. Yet, when Thomas observed her closely, he began to notice subtle contradictions, small but unsettling details that hinted at a complexity far beyond what the townspeople saw. Her smile was often just a fraction too controlled, her calmness measured to the point of precision. It was a serenity that felt rehearsed, almost like a mask. During his first visit, Thomas watched her move through the charity home with practiced ease, offering words of comfort to new arrivals while maintaining a distant, almost unreadable demeanor. She had a way of making her presence feel both protective and commanding, a duality that left Thomas uneasy. Her eyes, a pale and piercing blue, seemed to assess him constantly, weighing his intentions and probing for weaknesses. There was intelligence there, yes, but also something colder, a calculating sharpness that contrasted sharply with the softness she displayed outwardly. It was the kind of gaze that could make one feel both noticed and exposed, as if she were cataloguing everything about you, your movements, your questions, the subtle betrayals in your tone, while maintaining the illusion of warmth. Thomas learned from a former housekeeper that Sister Marianne had been in charge of the home for nearly 4 decades, inheriting the position from her predecessor under circumstances that were never fully explained. The caretaker spoke cautiously, as if the very mention of Marianne's name could invoke consequences. She hinted at Marianne's meticulous control over the home's operations, from finances to the daily routines of the widows, and even the ways in which new residents were introduced to the home. Everything was organized, deliberate, and in its place, yet the absence of any records about the women who had vanished suggested a layer of secrecy lurking beneath the surface. What struck Thomas most was the duality of Marianne herself, the public persona of a saintly guardian and the private aura of someone who wielded authority with almost imperceptible menace. The more he observed, the more he felt that Sister Marianne was not merely a caretaker, but a gatekeeper, a woman whose faith was intertwined with something darker, something that demanded loyalty, obedience, and silence. Every interaction with her left him with a sense of unease, as if the very walls of St. Aurelia's were extensions of her will, and every whispered rumor, every missing widow, was quietly part of a plan she had been orchestrating for decades. As Thomas began exploring the grounds surrounding St. Aurelia's, he noticed symbols carved into the bark of the ancient trees that ringed the property. At first, he thought they were the idle scratches of wanderers or perhaps children playing in the woods, but as he traced their patterns, a disturbing regularity emerged. The carvings were deliberate, methodical, and repeated at intervals, almost as if the forest itself had been inscribed with a secret language. Circles intersected with triangles, and unfamiliar runes formed lines that ran up the trunks and along fallen branches. They were faint in the fading light, but their presence was undeniable, and they seemed to form a network that connected the trees in an invisible grid. The forest, which had initially felt like a protective veil for the home, now gave Thomas the sense that it was watching, waiting, and somehow participating in what occurred within the charity's walls. Locals had always hinted that the woods surrounding the home were peculiar, but they never elaborated. When pressed, one elderly man muttered, "The trees remember more than we do," and quickly withdrew into his cabin, leaving Thomas to puzzle over the cryptic statement. The more he walked the paths, the more the carvings seemed to point toward certain areas: a clearing behind the chapel, the edge of the stream where the widows were known to walk, and an old stone wall partially hidden by ivy. Each cluster of symbols seemed to mark territory, like a map etched into living wood, and Thomas began to feel the weight of history pressing down through the rings of the trees. These were not mere decorations or warnings, they were deliberate markers, left behind to record, to guide, or perhaps to claim something. The patterns took on an even more sinister implication when Thomas realized their alignment coincided with the missing widows' timelines. Each disappearance corresponded roughly to the locations of the most intricate carvings. It was as if someone had been using the forest as a ledger, encoding each event into the living landscape in a way that was invisible to the casual observer. The carvings were too precise, too purposeful, to have been created randomly, and their persistence over decades suggested a continuity that went beyond the individuals who might have made them. The trees themselves had become silent witnesses to a ritual, a record of lives that were carefully harvested, perhaps even orchestrated, under the guise of sanctity. Thomas could not shake the feeling that the forest was not merely a backdrop, but an accomplice. The beauty of the tall pines and oaks masked a network of intent, a tapestry of secrecy that stretched through the woods and into the very foundation of St. Aurelia's. Every step he took seemed to echo in this living cathedral of carved symbols, and the realization settled over him like a frost. Whatever had claimed the 52 widows had left its signature not only on paper and memory, but on the land itself, woven into the quiet and unyielding watchfulness of the forest surrounding the home. While exploring the abandoned wing of St. Aurelia's, Thomas stumbled across a small, dust-covered diary wedged between loose floorboards. The leather cover was cracked and worn, the pages yellowed with age, yet the writing inside was surprisingly legible. It belonged to one of the missing widows, a woman named Eleanor, who had been admitted to the home nearly a decade earlier. Her words began innocuously enough, chronicling the mundane rhythms of life at the charity, the quiet prayers, the routines of chores, the gentle encouragements of Sister Marianne. But as he read further, the entries grew darker, tinged with unease and fear. Eleanor wrote about sounds that woke her at night, soft footfalls along the hallways, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves, and the occasional metallic echo of chains or hinges, though no chains were ever seen. It was the recurring mention of the chapel basement that chilled Thomas the most. Eleanor described gatherings held after hours, nights when the air smelled of incense mixed with something acrid, almost metallic, and faint murmurs rose in unison, a language she could not recognize but felt compelled to obey. She spoke of candlelight casting long shadows across the walls, of figures moving in slow, deliberate patterns, their faces hidden beneath hoods. Sometimes, she wrote, a new widow would be introduced in silence, guided to a particular place in the circle, her presence acknowledged only by nods from those already inside. Eleanor's handwriting became shaky in these passages, a visual echo of her growing terror, her words blurring as she struggled to capture the experience. What disturbed Thomas most was Eleanor's growing sense of inevitability. She seemed to understand that once a widow was fully drawn into these gatherings, there was no return, and she hinted that the rituals were tied to the promise of inheritance that had lured so many before her. The diary was meticulous in noting the sequence of events, yet it contained gaps, days when she simply stopped writing, as though she had been prevented from doing so. Some entries mentioned symbols carved into the walls of the basement, symbols that matched those Thomas had seen in the surrounding forest, connecting the home to the woods in a way that suggested the entire property was part of a single, deliberate design. Reading the diary, Thomas felt an oppressive weight, as if Eleanor's fear had seeped through the pages and into the room around him. He realized that the charm and serenity of St. Aurelia's were carefully constructed facades, masking a system that was both methodical and horrifying. The diary was more than a personal record, it was a map of terror, a guide that traced the intersection of devotion and danger, revealing the hidden mechanisms that had quietly ensnared 52 widows over 2 decades, and showing the lengths to which the home's true authority would go to maintain control and secrecy. As Thomas continued his investigation, he sought out anyone who had once worked at St. Aurelia's, hoping to uncover first-hand accounts of life inside the home. After persistent questioning and long waits at the local tavern and diner, he finally tracked down a former caretaker, a gaunt man named Samuel who had left the home under mysterious circumstances many years prior. Samuel's presence was tense, his eyes darting constantly, as if the very walls of Pine Hollow might overhear what he said. When Thomas pressed him for details, Samuel's voice dropped to a whisper, barely audible over the crackling fire in the hearth. He revealed that new widows were never admitted randomly. Each one was carefully selected by Sister Marianne, chosen based on wealth, social standing, and vulnerability. Invitations were sent under the guise of charity and divine protection, and the women often came willingly, believing they were entering a sanctuary. Samuel's revelation went deeper. He spoke of strict routines and rules, the ever-present observance that seemed to monitor every movement of the residents. He described how once a widow entered, she was guided through a subtle process of isolation, both physical and psychological. Interaction with the outside world was limited, letters were monitored, and friendships were controlled. According to Samuel, there was an unspoken understanding among the staff: the women who arrived would never leave, and no one was to question it. Any attempt to defy the system was quietly but effectively suppressed. Samuel recounted instances of employees being reassigned or disappearing themselves after they began asking too many questions, hinting at the home's control extending far beyond its widows. What struck Thomas most was the eerie calm with which Samuel described these measures. There was no malice in his tone, only a resigned acceptance, as if the rules of St. Aurelia's were absolute, unavoidable, and eternal. The caretaker explained that Sister Marianne wielded her authority with a combination of charisma and fear, maintaining a delicate balance that kept both staff and residents in line. Her presence was pervasive. Even when she was physically absent, her influence was felt in the precise order of the home, the unyielding schedules, and the rituals that governed daily life. Samuel emphasized that it was not just faith that bound the women to the home, but a carefully orchestrated system of psychological manipulation that rendered resistance nearly impossible. By the time Thomas left Samuel's small, dimly lit cabin, he understood that the charity home was far from the sanctuary it claimed to be. It was a machine, finely tuned to ensnare the vulnerable, with every detail, from selection to daily life, designed to ensure compliance. The realization was chilling. These disappearances were not accidents or tragedies, but the predictable outcomes of a meticulously maintained system, a trap disguised as salvation, operating with deliberate precision for decades, and it became painfully clear that the missing widows had entered a world from which escape was not simply discouraged, it was made impossible. As Thomas delved into the history of St. Aurelia's, he uncovered an unsettling layer that tied the home to the land itself. Digging through old town records, newspaper clippings, and property deeds, he discovered that the charity home sat atop a parcel of land once owned by a reclusive family in the late 1800s. The family, whose name had faded from most local memory, had long been the subject of whispers and suspicion. Rumors spoke of secretive rituals, arcane symbols, and a fascination with death that went far beyond conventional mourning practices. Some townspeople claimed they had seen strange figures moving through the property at night, cloaked in robes, chanting in a language none could understand. Others told of animals found mutilated at the edge of the forest, of fires burning in odd patterns, and of a pervasive aura of fear that clung to the land itself. While these stories were often dismissed as superstition, Thomas found that they bore a strange resemblance to the patterns he had already observed: the carved symbols, the controlled disappearances, the ritualistic air that seemed to emanate from the home. What struck him most was the continuity. The land had changed hands over decades, but the underlying energy, the sense of unseen watchfulness, had never dissipated. It was as if the property itself remembered the acts that had taken place, preserving a legacy that later residents could not escape. The reclusive family had disappeared from public records under mysterious circumstances, leaving behind only cryptic journals, ledger books, and fragments of oral history. Scholars who had attempted to study them noted an obsession with mortality, with controlling life and death through ritualistic means. Thomas began to understand that St. Aurelia's was not merely a home built for widows, it was a successor to something much older, a continuation of a practice that had been carefully cultivated over generations. The more he pieced together, the clearer it became that Sister Marianne's methods might not be purely her own invention. They seemed to echo the practices of the long-forgotten family, updated to suit a modern context. The isolation of the widows, the psychological manipulation, and the meticulous attention to detail mirrored the obsessive control that the previous owners had exerted over their property. Even the forest surrounding the home, with its carved symbols and invisible grids, could be traced back to this lineage of secrecy and ritual. Thomas felt a growing sense of dread as he realized that the disappearances of 52 widows were not anomalies or the result of one woman's ambition, they were part of a far older, deeply ingrained pattern. St. Aurelia's, he concluded, was built on land steeped in history, a place where tradition, superstition, and sinister intent had fused over generations to create a trap that preyed on the vulnerable, disguised under the guise of faith and charity. It was a legacy that had waited patiently, hidden in the shadows, for the right circumstances and the right people to perpetuate it, and the widows had become its latest victims. The sense of dread that had been building throughout Thomas's investigation reached a crescendo one stormy night when a sudden blackout plunged St. Aurelia's into total darkness. The old wiring had always been unreliable, and the violent thunderstorm outside ensured that the home was cut off from the outside world. Candlelight flickered in the hallways, casting elongated shadows that twisted and writhed like living things. The silence between the crack of thunder was almost unbearable, broken only by the distant drip of water and the faint creak of floorboards underfoot. Thomas felt a growing urgency to explore, an instinct that told him the truth about the home lay somewhere he had not yet ventured, beneath it. He found the entrance to the basement tucked behind an unmarked wooden door in the chapel. The air that escaped was damp and fetid, carrying the unmistakable scent of decay mixed with incense, a combination that made him gag yet compelled him to move forward. As he descended the narrow steps, his flashlight revealed a labyrinth of tunnels carved into the earth, reinforced with old timber that groaned under its own age. The walls were lined with objects that made Thomas's stomach churn, fragments of clothing, shards of porcelain, and bones partially covered by dust and cobwebs. It became horrifyingly clear that these tunnels had not been built for storage or utility, they were part of a deliberate design, a subterranean network intended to contain and control. The further Thomas moved into the darkness, the more he felt the weight of the home's history pressing in on him. Symbols similar to those he had seen carved in the forest appeared etched into the stone and timber, some fresh, some ancient, forming an intricate web of ritualistic markers. He realized that the tunnels themselves were an extension of the land's dark legacy, a conduit linking the charity home to the ancient practices of the long-forgotten family who had once owned the property. Each corridor seemed to pulse with a malevolent intent, as if the walls themselves were aware of his intrusion, tracking his every movement. Then he noticed the remnants of makeshift rooms within the labyrinth, small spaces that had clearly been inhabited, each containing personal items belonging to women who had vanished. The realization hit with unbearable force. This was where the widows had been kept, and perhaps where some still remained, lost in the shadows of the home's meticulously maintained machinery of control. The basement was not merely a storage area, it was a holding ground, a stage for rituals, and a repository for the bodies, belongings, and lives that had been claimed over decades. Thomas understood, with a bone-deep certainty, that the charity home's surface serenity was a facade. Beneath it lay a deliberate system of concealment, a network designed to maintain secrecy and terror simultaneously. The tunnels told a story that no ledger or diary could fully capture, a story of calculated disappearance, of devotion twisted into imprisonment, and of decades of lives systematically harvested to feed the obscure and sinister mechanisms of the home, its founder, and the legacy embedded in the land itself. By the time Thomas confronted Sister Marianne, the tension in St. Aurelia's had reached a breaking point. He had spent weeks piecing together the layers of secrecy, following the trails of symbols, diaries, and eyewitness accounts, and now the weight of his discoveries pressed against him like the very walls of the home. Marianne greeted him with her familiar, serene composure, her hands folded neatly in front of her, her eyes betraying nothing, at least, not at first. But as Thomas presented the evidence he had gathered, the ledger of inheritances, the patterns of disappearances, the network of tunnels and carved symbols, he noticed something shift in her expression. The calm, saintly facade faltered for the briefest of moments, revealing a glimmer of something far more calculating, far older, and far darker than the benevolent caretaker she had portrayed for decades. The confrontation began subtly, with Thomas carefully framing his questions, trying to gauge her reactions, to see if the woman before him was merely an orchestrator of the home's routines or the mastermind behind the vanishings. Marianne's voice remained soft, measured, even melodic, but the eyes, the pale, piercing blue eyes that had seemed so unreadable, now glinted with an intensity that made Thomas uneasy. Slowly, piece by piece, she allowed the mask to slip. The story she told was not one of blind devotion to charity or faith, it was a confession of lineage, strategy, and inheritance. She revealed that she was the last surviving heir of the family that had once owned the land, a family whose history had been steeped in rituals, arcane knowledge, and an obsessive control over life and death. Everything Thomas had uncovered, the disappearances, the tunnels, the carvings, the patterns of inheritance, was part of a tradition she had inherited, refined, and perpetuated. Sister Marianne spoke of the widows not as victims but as participants in a system that extended beyond their understanding, a design carefully constructed over generations. Her calm articulation contrasted sharply with the horrors implied by her words. She described manipulation, observation, and discipline with the precision of someone explaining the operation of a clock. She spoke of the forest, the land, and the home as extensions of her authority, vessels through which the family's legacy could endure. The ledger, the carvings, the tunnels, they were all instruments, ensuring that the system remained intact and that the inheritance, in its truest form, was preserved and passed on. As Thomas absorbed the revelation, a profound realization settled over him. The danger was not merely in the building, the land, or even the forest, it resided in the woman herself. Sister Marianne was not only a caretaker but a living continuation of a centuries-old design, a guardian of secrets and power, and the architect of every fate that had been sealed within St. Aurelia's walls. The serene, saintly figure was gone, replaced by the undeniable presence of someone whose intelligence, patience, and devotion had been channeled into sustaining a mechanism of control and horror, and he understood that everything he had uncovered was only the beginning of understanding the true extent of her influence. The final revelation that Thomas uncovered was more chilling than anything he had imagined, and it reshaped the entire story of St. Aurelia's in a way that made every disappearance even more sinister. 4 years, the town had believed the widows were taken by tragedy, illness, or fate, and even the most skeptical investigators had assumed that money, inheritance, or property were the primary motives. But as Thomas examined the evidence, spoke to former employees, and pieced together the diaries and tunnels beneath the chapel, a far darker truth emerged. The inheritance, it seemed, had never been financial. It was something far more intangible, something ancient, deliberate, and predatory. The widow's wealth and assets were simply the bait. What Sister Marianne and the lineage she carried were truly after was the essence of the women themselves, their vitality, their devotion, and their very being, passed down and collected in a hidden, ritualistic legacy. The tunnels, the symbols carved into the forest, the meticulous records in the ledgers, and the carefully orchestrated isolation of each widow all pointed to the same conclusion. The home was a trap, but not in the way the townspeople imagined. St. Aurelia's was less a charitable refuge than a vessel for a tradition that had persisted for generations, a system that harvested something essential from the widows in a manner that defied ordinary comprehension. The disappearance of each woman was calculated, ritualized, and codified, ensuring that the family's legacy, the power tied to the land and its practices, continued uninterrupted. Wealth and property were only the surface layer, a socially acceptable justification that obscured the more sinister operation hidden beneath the home's calm, pious exterior. Thomas came to understand that the land, the home, and Sister Marianne herself were intertwined instruments of this legacy. The carvings in the forest, which had at first seemed like eccentric or occult markers, were in fact part of a ritual geography, mapping out energy, life, and control. The tunnels beneath the chapel were more than storage, they were repositories and conduits, channels through which the family's intentions and power flowed, maintaining a continuity that stretched across decades. The widows, lured by faith and the promise of security, became both participants and sacrifices in a mechanism that transcended their understanding, their inheritances functioning as mere gateways into a system far older than anyone alive in Pine Hollow. In the end, Thomas realized that what had been harvested was not simply material or even corporeal. It was the very essence of those who entered the home, their devotion, their energy, their lives, woven into a legacy that demanded continuation. 52 widows, over 22 years, had vanished not because they were unlucky or vulnerable, but because they had been chosen for something much more deliberate and ancient. The inheritance trap, it turned out, was never about money. It was about perpetuation, a macabre succession that awaited its next vessel, hidden beneath the serene surface of faith, ritual, and the forested shadows surrounding Saint Aurelia's